Good evening. So tonight I want to talk about the Adonica Aulder bill situation and give my take on it. So Travis Chase ran with two different stories over the past 48 hours. One with respect to Ms. Aulder being granted bail, and the second was um, with respect to consequences that a police officer faced when she commands the airport division. And so she was transferred because Ms. Aldo was allowed to leave the country. So it raises some important legal issues. The issues involve jurisdiction as well. So you see here that Travis Chase wrote a story, and he said that was a December 5th story where he reported that Chief Magistrate Faith Gusty granted an application for Miss Aulder to leave the country. And then Travis reported that Miss Aulder is the pregnant wife of embattled Assistant Commissioner Calvin Brutus. I mean, it may or may not have been necessary to mention Mr. Brutus, since Ms. Alder's application, I'm sure, was granted in its own right without regard to Mr. Brutus, but rather on the merits of Ms. Alder's application. UC Anderson and I were classmates at Hugh Wooden Law School during the 6-month program. And there's no doubt that UC Anderson is a bright lawyer, having graduated from Cambridge University with his master's in law. And he could be strategically smart, but the issue here is not that. The issue here is jurisdiction. So from what the news said, Magistrate McGusty previously granted bail to Ms. Alder. And not only did she grant bail, but she granted bail. Ms. Alder had 2 charges, and each charge carried a bail amount of $500,000. So she had to deposit $1 million through a surety, and she had to lodge her passport. And the question is whether she lodged her passport with the police or whether it was lodged with the court. But prior to her being charged, on October 18th, Justice Gino Prasad had refused an application by Mr. Brutus, where the application was for Mr. Brutus to accompany Ms. Alder to the U.S. for medical attention. Right, and the issue here, I haven't seen the judgment of Justice Prasad, but I suspect the issue there would have been comparable medical care, whether the care that Ms. Alder sought could have been readily available in Guyana. And in light of the charges, whether Mr. Brutus would have been a flight risk. I'm sure that's what the state would have argued. I'm not sure what would have prevented Ms. Alder from leaving the country, but what is interesting is certainly if the U.S. Embassy felt that the charges against Ms. Alder had legs, they would have revoked her passport. They would have revoked her visa. If she left for the United States for medical care and she's a Guyanese citizen, then the fact that she still retained her US visa in light of the charges that she faced tells what assessment the US Embassy made about the viability of those charges, which is an interesting point. But in this case, if the application was contested, so if you see, so my take on it is this. Chief Justice Gusty granted bail, and she granted bail with the proviso that Ms. Aulder lodged her passport. And let me see what previous Guyana courts have said about that, because there was a case involving Rupert Rupnerine on that score. See what the court have said on that score. Right. Oh, so this was the Walter Rodney Commission, and they were dealing with Dr. Rodney and his wife. And Jacqueline Samuels Brown said, as she said, Dr. Roma, while he does not recall at all any restrictions being put on his travel as a condition of bail, his passport being taken as a consequence of him being granted bail. And Dr. Patricia Rodney said more or less the same thing in relation to her husband as far as she knew. So they didn't know. And then Ramson, the former justice, he says, I think if the magistrate gave permission to leave the country, knowing what I know about the legal system at a proper level and at an improper level, the magistrate would have been fired. So he's saying that during Burnham time, in the late 70s and the 80s, if the magistrate give bail and allow travel, then the magistrate would have been released of their duties. But in this case, in 2024, the magistrate did ask that the passport be lodged. And when the magistrate did that, let's see what Rupnerine versus Baker said. It says in Barton versus De Oliveira, 24 WIR 261, Guyana Court of Appeal. Barton of Foreign Nassau was convicted in the magistrate court and was sentenced to pay $67,500, or a default of which payment to be imprisoned for a term of 12 months. He had left the country before satisfying the judgment of the court after he had filed a notice of appeal. And later, while still out of the country, he sought an extension of time within which to appeal to the Court of Appeal. His application was refused, but Crane J.A. at 1977, 24 WIR, page 263 said, had he applied in the proper way for permission to leave the country, I think it's very likely he would have been allowed to leave and uplift his passport, which the police had in their keeping, provided that he gives security for his appearance before the full court where judgment was to be pronounced. And then it seems like they were citing Locke also, and Locke says, had the applicant informed the full court of his intention to travel abroad for any good reason, the court could have either expedited hearing of the appeal or grant leave for the applicant to travel abroad and postpone the hearing of his appeal until his return to the country, a time limit being fixed for his return. So reading Rupnarayan versus Baker, and I don't know what cases Mr. Anderson argued, but Rupnarayan versus Baker does not foreclose the possibility of someone leaving the country. And of course, you have the Paul Slow situation where Paul Slow is allowed to leave and return for his hearing dates when they're not on Zoom. So there's no, so, and in the era of Zoom, Ms. Alder can always appear via Zoom for her matters. So it's not a foregone conclusion that she has to be in Guyana. I mean, the only troubling thing about Miss Alder's situation is that, you know, when you saw the affidavit of Karim Bash, it showed her like they're making allegations against Calvin Brutus, Miss Alder, and their infant son, which is quite unfortunate, as far as I feel in respect to the infant son, not only in respect to him, but in respect to his full name being in court documents and in the public. But Adonica Aulder in Guyanese Storm was rich. In one account, she had $1,584,226, or a business account at $243,398,370. Another account at $12,255,248. And most of these accounts were freezed by the court. Right, most of these accounts were freezed by the court. But the situation is that if Miss Alder could appear in court via Zoom, if her personal appearance is necessary, you know, if indeed she provided evidence that, you know, herself and the baby in utero are in danger if they couldn't leave Guyana, then the question is, who had the jurisdiction to grant her the emergency order to leave? Does the magistrate, having imposed a condition that she lodge her passport, has a jurisdiction to reconsider that? If the magistrate is able to reconsider that, does it require the agreement of the prosecutor, the state, and the defense? If there's no agreement between the state and the defense, is this a matter that goes before the High Court for determination before a judge? Was a stay granted or applied for in respect to the order that was granted by the chief magistrate? I mean, there's a lot of questions in respect to this case, and the news reported tonight that the police command at the airport were removed with immediate effect. Right, the deputy superintendent and the staff that were manning the immigration staff that were manning the booths, they were all removed from the airport. But I mean, looking at the Patterson's case, there was the former minister Patterson and the problems that arose when he was prevented from leaving the country in the face of a valid judicial order. What discretion does an immigration officer has or does the supervisor of the immigration officers have to stop a Guyanese from moving, from leaving the country in the face of a valid judicial order? So that's an interesting issue that comes up with respect to the deputy superintendent that was transferred. Did she have any jurisdiction? Could she have done anything in the face of a valid court order? And it seemed to me like, absent a stay of that order, the immigration officials had no jurisdiction to do anything. And then we have to look at this situation with a compassionate view. A female pregnant, and one thing that was reported is that she had a medical appointment in the US. The baby is due in March, and if she missed her appointment, the next appointment is in May 2025. So, we always have to look at these things from a trauma-informed lens, and we have to look at it with empathy. Like, I have no sympathy for Calvin Brutus simply because of what I know about him. And, the things that he said about me. One of my friends called him once about something, and he said, "Hey, we don't do salvin-peters around here. This is the police. And this is the second highest person in the command of the Guyana Police Force telling another senior military officer, we don't do salvin-peters." I didn't mention that to the president of Guyana, Mohammed Orfanali, who is a friend of mine, a personal friend. I didn't bother to mention it to him. But what I did tell the president of Guyana is that I don't trust the police in Guyana. And I don't trust them simply because of that is one of those instances that made me have no trust for the police. If a senior police officer could say, we don't do salvin-peters. Well, what if salvin-peters is a victim of a crime in Guyana? But getting back to Ms. Aulder, I hope this situation with her is dealt with judiciously, because certainly she's charged, she's not convicted of any offense, and she's entitled to her human rights being respected. She's entitled to her constitutional rights being respected. And to the extent that her freedom of movements are not implicated, she should be entitled to leave Guyana and return to Guyana as she so choose. I don't think it was right to punish the senior police officers and others for letting her leave. It sends the wrong message. They're not entitled to disobey a court order. They're entitled to respect court orders. Irrespective of who she is. And Ms. Aulder is quite connected to the PPP hierarchy. She's related in some way to the Edghill. So Minister Edghill and his family and her has a very close familial relationship. They were all at her wedding, and so on and so forth. So She has connections too within the PPP.